I love Denis Villeneuve. It's been so interesting kind of seeing him move from small intimate dramas like Prisoners and Enemy into big budget sci-fi like Blade Runner 2049 or Arrival. He's kind of on Christopher Nolan's level as one of those auteurs that really gets the chance to do whatever he really feels like, because he's just able to really rein in general audiences but also still treat them like they're smart people, which is really important in mainstream blockbuster filmmaking. And he just writes characters in such interesting ways, and he really just rounds out the worlds that he creates. Even if it's abstract ones like Enemy, he really knows how to flesh them out. So it made kind of perfect sense for him to make something like Dune. It's a story full of unorthodox politics, sci-fi worlds, and epic sequences, but at the root of it all, what I think really connects with me is that it's a coming-of-age story. It's a story about someone learning to overcome their own fears and find their own place in the world. Just it happens to be space royalty in a far distant future that's beyond our comprehension. The first movie really works well because it has all the Denis Villeneuve elements, like his large sense of scale and even the cold emotional exterior that he always starts with, but it always functions as an interesting story. Paul's growing into the world and his own humanity is something that's at the core of all Denis' film. A common critique that is often leveraged at a lot of Denis' films is that it's emotionally cold. However, I really disagree because I find that's the point in a lot of his stories. A lot of his sci-fi stories especially, they're about overcoming sterile, inhumane world that our characters inhabit, essentially finding the soul. That is essentially what 2049 and Arrival are about, and with Dune and its sequel, it's kind of another extension of that theme. Dune Part 2 is basically continuing Paul's journey as him and his mother, Jessica, join the Fremen. They try to maneuver their way back to power as the Harkonnens, who took over in the last movie, and the Emperor realize that they're still alive and have to basically effectively neutralize them. Off of my initial thoughts, because it's probably one of my most anticipated movies for this year, and it was for last year until it got delayed because of the strike, well, Denis really built off the original perfectly. It's fucking epic. Everything that the original had in scale, in character, is just grown and just completely excels. And it's a large, near 3-hour epic that just had me hooked immediately. I literally could not believe that it was over. And that's just one part of this amazing machine that is this movie. So kind of starting off, the performances, once again, Timothée Chalamet is phenomenal in the role. At this point, he is definitely setting himself up to be a proper movie star. And in this one, what really impressed me is that he gets the emotional range that was kind of promised from the end of the last one. He gets to be scarier, more intense. He's a lot more divided on what he is supposed to do. He feels almost like he doesn't want to be forced into a place, but he rather wants to function as a normal person. He's always felt like he was royalty, and that's really interesting. And I think the way his arc kind of ends, it creates an interesting struggle that almost feels very bleak. Rebecca Ferguson plays Jessica with the same amount of intensity as before. She was my favorite performance in the last movie, and in this one she's actually given a lot more of an interesting direction. I won't necessarily spoil the tone of it, but it was something that felt in line with that character, but was also very dark and very interesting, and definitely very curious to see where that can go. Javier Bardem and Zendaya get larger roles, and honestly, same thing, go in very interesting directions. Bardem plays Stilgar with the same dry sense of humor that he's always had in a lot of his other movies, but he's a lot more overt, and it's actually interesting how much they play up that humorous side, because there is a darkness to him as well that plays really well. Zendaya is the heart of the film. Especially in the third act, she's given so many quiet moments to react, but you can always kind of sense where she's at. I really do feel that chemistry between her and Timothée Chalamet, and it really shows in those sequences where they connect and she's kind of teaching him about Fremen lifestyles and how they both kind of learn about their differences in their upbringing. It's really interesting, actually. And then we get some of the new cast, and Austin Butler is suitably terrifying as Feyd-Rautha. And it's kind of insane how he went from Elvis to this, because he's doing a bit of a Stellan Skarsgård impression, which makes sense. That voice and even his mannerisms that he brings to that character make him feel so alien, and it in turn makes him scarier and very, very effective. Everyone else is great, but they don't necessarily have a lot of screen time. However, they still all leave a strong impression. I think the cast that I would have probably liked to have seen more of would have been Christopher Walken and Florence Pugh, but they still do a great job regardless. Kind of going off of the directing and the technical aspects, Denis directs the hell out of this. What's really interesting about this is that it shares a lot of visual similarities with the original, but he opts for more handheld shots during intimate sequences, which really actually helps immerse you in these characters because it becomes far more of a personal journey, which this movie is. There's a lot more of these characters sitting and thinking, and Paul kind of trying to interpret his visions because he's given a whole lot of new ones. What's also interesting is that it still has those amazing IMAX wide shots from the original, and they're insanely detailed. It only goes to show how large everything is, and it really benefits those gigantic fight sequences that show up. Greg Fraser is slowly becoming one of my favorite cinematographers. Between this, the first Dune, the Batman, and the Creator, he is out here composing immaculate shots. I'm really excited to see what else he's gonna do. The set design is amazing with so many interesting lighting decisions, especially in one specific set towards the end of the movie that really stood out. The sequences on the Harkonnen Gladiator planet, and especially the first big action sequence of the movie, are really well staged, and it really goes to show that Denis really had these ideas and these strong visions for where he wanted to take this. It didn't seem like he was obligated to tell the sequel or the story. Like, he kind of went in being like, I already have ideas. That's at least what it comes off to me as. And then Hans Zimmer's score is probably at his loudest, and appropriately so. It's really aggressive, especially compared to the original, but the stings and how they're placed throughout the film lead to easily some of the best moments in the entire film. It feels like natural extensions of the sounds he made in the original, and because this movie is paying off a lot of what was set up in the original, it kind of deserves that bombastic feel of it. The sound design is really crisp, and it honestly is able to really choose when it's supposed to be quiet and when it's supposed to be loud. And there's a lot of things like quiet breezes and breaths and even sand moving around to some of the loudest explosions and just gigantic screaming, and it just completely overwhelms you. The seats in the theater were literally shaking. What exactly about the story can I talk about without spoiling? Well, let's just say that the story pays off the elements from the original perfectly. The first act of the movie gives you a pretty good amount of time to breathe. You don't really feel the urgency of the story yet, which is honestly fine because the amount of plot this movie has to get through, and it somehow still has the time to focus on small character beats, is actually really interesting. And it takes its time to really show how Paul and Jessica ingrain themselves in Fremen culture. They show that not all the Fremen necessarily believe in Paul, and how what he basically has to do to prove himself, and even if he really wants to. And in the meantime, you're still building up all these villains. They're slowly realizing that Paul is still alive. It's really large in scope, but it still manages to find that time for very intimate moments. And what's genuinely fascinating is see how these characters do that political maneuvering. It's a kind of gaining the upper hand. Paul finds himself at such a solid crossroads, which leads to such a good arc. By the end of the movie, he feels like this grizzled man who's been through like so much, and he's barely even the same person from the start of the original. The final act is really where things come together, and without spoiling, it is able to find this weird middle ground between being so satisfying but also feeling so open-ended and bleak. And I won't spoil much, but that's essentially what I felt. And by the time the end happens, you're just so exhausted because you feel like you've been through it with these characters. The themes in this one feel like such natural extensions of the last, and it basically asks the question, what happens when Paul finally conquers his fears? And in addition, I haven't seen a mainstream movie that really analyzes deep concepts like religious radicalism and how political turmoil basically feeds into that. It feels so organic and woven into the story that it never really feels like the movie has to go out of its way to explain itself to you. My only real cons, if I were to name any, were that there are some specific narrative beats and revelations that happen that feel a tad rushed, and in a story that is constantly developing more and more characters and fulfilling its role as a conclusion, and possibly a middle entry in a trilogy, it's bound to feel packed with story. And while these specific beats do come back into play really nicely, I still feel like when they are finally revealed or emerge, I feel like they could use a bit of time to relax. Otherwise, this is one of those special sci-fi movies that you get every once in a while, that it gets to stand up there with the likes of the original Blade Runner, Alien, Terminator, 2001. It captures that rich world building that Denis Villeneuve is so good at, but it has some of the most gorgeous shot composition I have ever seen in a theater. Please go see this in IMAX. It was so worth it. What I love most is that all that style is backed up by great unique character writing and genuinely awe-inspiring dialogue. It feels really good to just properly kick off 2024 with an instant classic. I can really only hope that the year has more to offer, because this is a pretty great way to start off.